Hello and welcome back to the Single Malt Frontier, where we explore the edge of innovation in American single malt whiskey. Here on the show, we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Usually we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey is the conversations that we get to have along the way, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. I'm your host, Doug, or as I'm known around the internet, Demi Tastes. I'm joined today, as usual, by my co-host, Phil, from the Rangers Respite. He's currently in a different location than usual, which I'm sure you can all appreciate because it is the holiday week. And before we go too far into that, our guest today is the founder and chieftain of Boulder Spirits, Alastair Brogan. And we are here to talk today about the founding of Boulder Spirits, the sort of philosophy behind the American single malt style that they make. And we'll also talk a little bit about independent brand ownership. So this is going to be an exciting time for us. We also have a new whiskey. So we've had Boulder Spirits on the show before, and our guest then was Ryan Negley. I believe it was episode 21, but don't quote me on that. I don't have that handy right off the top of my head. Phil might be able to figure it out and correct me if I'm wrong on that. We did 6 whiskeys at that time, and there is a 7th that we have in our hands now, which is the Boulder Spirits Leave No Trace. So with any luck, we'll get around to talking about that today as well. Just a couple of notes of self-promotion. I won't belabor this point because you've heard us talk about it quite a lot lately. As usual, there are the barrel stave pens that Phil makes. You can buy them on his Etsy. We have merch. We have Whiskey Lodge engraved Glencairn glasses. I'll make my face bigger for a moment so you can see this better. So we've got Whiskey Lodge engraved Glencairn glasses. This is if you're a member of the Whiskey Lodge or you're interested in checking out the Whiskey Lodge. This is where Phil and I hang out. You could talk to us about all things spirits, but it is not exactly a podcast associated brand. It just happens to be that that's where we like to hang out. And we haven't seen a need to make our own community yet. We also have Glencairn's branded with the podcast logo, and this is also the sticker we used on our McCarthy's barrel pick. You can still buy the McCarthy's barrel pick. I don't actually know how many bottles of that are left, but you can find out information about that in the description, as well as the Glencairns in the description, and a link to the Whiskey Lodge in the description. And if Phil reminds me, I'll add a link to his Etsy in the description as well. So those are all the ways you can support us, and I did that in less than a minute, I think. So with no further ado, let's introduce Alastair Brogan. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I really do hope I'm saying your name correctly.
Oh, you froze there.
Am I frozen again? Phil, am I gone?
I see you moving.
Okay. Oof. Now I have no idea.
You're back.
Okay. So now I have no idea how much of that actually made it to episode 16. Thank you for correcting me on that, Phil. I don't know what's going on with the internet today. Mine, yours, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what's actually managing to stream out right now.
Let me pull up on the stream on YouTube. It looks like Alastair's is frozen and you are being streamed.
Okay.
I can hear you guys.
Now I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you both.
Okay. Well, this will be a fun one to cut, maybe. Okay, so Alastair, do we have you? I think so.
Yeah, you do.
Yep.
Let me just ask the audience. Please let us know if you can't see or hear any one of us. But more importantly, hopefully, we'll at least be able to hear Alastair, because this is mostly an audio podcast, even though we have the video format. So let's try that again in case you didn't hear me. Alastair Brogan, founder and chieftain of Boulder Spirits. Welcome to the podcast. And if you wouldn't mind, tell us a bit about yourself and what you do.
Oh, okay. I'll start at the beginning then. So yeah, my name's Alastair Brogan. I'm the owner of Vapor Distillery, which our brands are all under the name Boulder Spirits. And a little bit background for myself. you'll hear from my accent. I'm not from Colorado. I'm from and we decided to move after her spending 5 years in the dank and rainy Scotland. We decided to move to the US. And before we left, we picked Boulder as the place Colorado, where we really wanted to live. Boulder ended up being decided on. And what I wanted to do was buy a Scottish copper pot still, and I bought one from Forsyth of Rose. And I wanted to come to the US, and I wanted to, as a whole, best American single malt whiskey I could. And so I brought my still from Forsyth's and started laying down whiskey. And we arrived here 13 years ago, started laying down whiskey about 8 years ago. Are you still with us?
Yep.
I am trying to figure out if the issue is on my end. I am losing Alastair pretty regularly in terms of video and audio.
Mm-hmm.
So, audience, is it just me? Because if it's just me, we're fine. Phil?
Sorry, my internet is just a little bit laggy, so I'm not the best judge.
We might just be having a bad time today.
Yeah, I mean, I can hear you guys fine.
Okay, Johnify Me says on Instagram can see everything. Proceed with the pod making. Had him for 90%. Okay, so maybe it's just on my end, and that's totally fine. We'll this is going to be awkward for me though. Do we want to try starting over? Or should we just proceed apace? Yeah. I'm honestly not okay, here's what I'll do. I'm gonna rejoin because maybe it's on my end. So give me 30 seconds. Maybe we all take turns rejoining.
All right.
And then
the
best we can get, probably.
And while he's doing that, for the benefit of our audience, Mr. Brogan, you said that you bought your still from Forsyth's? I think I've lost my mic.
I think I'm still okay.
Okay, I'm back. As far as I can tell, self-monitoring is hard. That's the problem here.
I think Doug's trying to rejoin. See how he goes.
All right, Doug, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me? I'm back. I can't hear Alastair though. I'm honestly not sure if it's just me.
I don't think so.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay, is that better?
You are back.
Yeah, I was actually forced out there and had to rejoin.
Okay.
Oh,
So is that a lot better?
For now, I think so.
yep.
Okay.
Okay, where do we go back to then?
Well, let's talk about because it sounded like Carrie caught about most of that. So let's go back to you purchased a still from Forsyth's, right?
So yeah, I think you've disappeared. I think you can hear me.
Yes.
You put your thumbs up if you can hear me. Yeah, great. Well, yeah. So almost 13 years ago, I moved to the US. I brought a Forsyth's copper pot still with me, and I wanted to make the very best American single malt whiskey I could. So having that start point with a Forsyth's copper pot still was really fantastic for me. And I then looked around Colorado, looked at the scene of the distilling scene here, and I joined up with existing actually gin company, and we make some phenomenal gins as well. And we joined up, and we wanted to start laying down whiskey, and we started laying down whiskey about 9 years ago, and we started laying down single malt coming from the Forsyth's copper pot still. And now our oldest whiskey is on that 8-9 year mark, and we're still going full pelt. But really, it was going to be a hobby initially, but like a lot of things, once you get into it, the hobby then became the business, and now it's taking up 100% of my time, and I'm absolutely loving it, and what we're doing here and what we're creating here in Colorado. Colorado is a very unique climate, very unique location to produce whiskey.
So that's wild to me. What exactly was it like to come with a giant copper pot still? How did you manage to get that overseas?
Well, I went to Richard Forsyth, which is the third generation producer, and in Scotland, is like in whiskey, there's lots of peaks and troughs. So it's boom or bust, and that's why in Scotland there's very few copper still makers left, because a lot of them disappeared when the whiskey industry dipped. But Forsyths have kept alive. They also do a lot of the oil offshore work. So the Scottish exploration industry. So they survived. And actually, when I bought the still, next day Macallan had ordered about 16 stills. And so I phoned up Richard and said, "Hey, Richard, are you going to bump me? And it's going to be more than the 3-year waiting list that I was on." And his comment to me was, "Alastair, you're still..." neck, flanged at the condenser. So we had to actually build it in 3 parts. But what was interesting was when he delivered it, I opened it up. We took all the wood off, and we looked inside, and there was something really deep inside of the still. So we went into the still, we brought it out. There's about, I would say about 36 inches to get into the still. And we went into the still, and we brought this box out, and we had no idea what it was. And we opened it up, and it was full of cookies or cakes that was from a local. Oh, what was it called? Can't remember the name of the company. It was a local company, very Scottish company, and he'd filled this up, and it was like a gift to us for that. So we ate through those. But yeah, it was the day that we opened that. We joined it all together, because every single still that's made from Forsyth is individual, and it's individual for that company, the flavors and profiles that you're wanting. They can do it within a range. We wanted something to give us heavy whiskey, so we wanted less reflux in the still. We wanted the Lin arm that would give us less reflux. It's 11 degree pointing down. We wanted it a little bit smaller, a little bit squattier. And he designed that still specifically to give us less reflux, heavier whiskey, because the challenge in the US is that malt whiskey goes into new charred oak barrels, and new charred oak barrels could eventually and will eventually overtake the whiskey inside. So, I'm not a bourbon guy, but, 12, 14, 15 years, that char starts overtaking. Well, that's why we wanted a heavy whiskey. And a heavy whiskey then gives us more chance that after 10, 12, 13 years, perhaps, that we won't get that real overpowering oakiness, those tannins, that leathery flavor. And so far, 8 years on, we've still got that whiskey that's not being overtaken. If you put an Irish whiskey, a light whiskey in a new oak barrel, you'll be licking leather after a few years. So we wanted something heavy.
Sounds good to me. And I think from our experience in the last interview, which Phil corrected me, was episode 16. The last time we had Boulder Spirits on the show. We tasted through all the whiskeys, and frankly, we're quite impressed. Did not know that a new charred oak American single malt whiskey could be so. It's a delightful mix of something that feels like it has a single malt philosophy, as well as something that feels like it's embodying the sort of bourbon-ish new charred oak philosophy, and really marrying those two things exceptionally well. I love bringing out Boulder Spirits as an introduction during any tasting where we talk about American single malt whiskey, where you're coming from bourbon, great, try Boulder Spirits, because it's got that new charred oak for you. And it's not just, it's technically new charred oak, but it tastes like a single malt. It tastes like the flavor profile you'd expect from a new charred oak whiskey, without being, like you say, you're not licking leather or wood chips. It is delightfully balanced against the malt. And so it lets that malt shine through as well. And it gives you that introduction to single malt at the same time. So I've poured myself the New American, by the way, as a nice starting point. It's always good to start here.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it also, with that new charred oak, it leans into that flavor profile. Some of that flavor profile Americans are used to. That new char Americans are used to. You give or any single malt, American single malt, to a Scotch drinker, and he'll pick up two things. He'll pick up, first of all, a char, and that comes from the new oak barrel. And then second thing he'll do is say, hey, there's a little bit more sweetness here. And again, that sweetness is coming from that caramelization of the natural sugars in the barrel, in the oak. So it becomes a little sweeter. And those two things lean towards the American bourbon drinker or American whiskey drinkers flavor profile. So even though it's a completely different whiskey, and now a new category of whiskey, it does lean towards some of the flavors that the Americans are used to. And remember, Scotch whiskey as well has an infusion. Almost all Scotch whiskey has an infusion of bourbon in it. That infusion of the bourbon comes from the ex-bourbon barrels. So that maybe, best guess, 5 liters in a 200-liter barrel. that is infusing into all Scotch whiskey. Now, you try and tell a Scotch whiskey drinker in Scotland that doesn't like bourbon that he's actually drinking some bourbon when he drinks Scotch whiskey, he gets a little pissed off. He doesn't get that, but it is, and you can see that from. We also do some barrels that are ex-bourbon barrels, and the difference between ex-bourbon barrels made in Boulder whiskey, single malt, and New Oak is it's a different. It's almost it's a different whiskey, and that's what's the great thing about playing around with New Oak now with American Single Malt Whiskey, as well as second fill oak. So you can play around with that. You're always going to get closer to Scotch with second fill barrels. But when I say closer, we don't want to be a Scotch. All of us want to be an American single malt whiskey, and all the factors, whether it be the water, the climate, which we could spend hours on, the climate, the New Oak barrels, the temperature swings, the dryness of Colorado, the heat of Texas, all those things play a part. So it's uniquely American, as is Australian single malt or New Zealand single malt or German single malt. It's unique to that location. And that's what us as a community really are experimenting with those different, microclimates, barrels, and finding new flavors and tastes.
I absolutely agree with all of those things. I mean, there are so many factors, and United States of America is such a large country with such varying climates. Anything that you could think of that could have a factor, somebody could be playing with that variable. I think it's easy enough to say of Boulder Spirits. Like if I was going to go talk to somebody who knows a little bit about Scotch, a little bit about bourbon, it's easy enough for me to say this is as close to a 50-50 fusion of Scotch and bourbon as you could ever hope to see. You've got a distillery founded by a Scotsman who wants to make American single malt like inspired by Scotch single malt Scotch in the United States of America, but do it with a American whiskey philosophy. And so you've got 100% malted barley on a pot still, which is, in my opinion, that's pretty much the quintessential part of the definition of single malt. And then you have the other part that is an inescapable conclusion for most categories of American whiskey, which is you're going to use new charred oak barrels. And so you've got both of those things in this one product. So with that said, of all those factors that you just mentioned and of everything that I just said, what to you were the things that were quintessentially single malt that you could not compromise, and quintessentially American whiskey that you wanted to bring into that product?
So, and this is a controversial point, and a lot of distilleries have done this. One of the factors was when I started was American malt. And controversially, I decided to bring my malt in from Europe. Now, the reason I did that was because I felt that American malt, which tends not to be used in whiskey, maybe 5-10% in bourbons to have that help break down the enzymes in the mash. I brought mine from Europe because it's designed for single malt, whereas the malt in America is designed for beer. It's not really used in whiskey making. And we actually use a local malting house that makes distiller's malt, and we actually do it for them as a private bottling for them. When I say a private bottling, I love this story. A local farmer who can't sell his product at the end of the year will have to either feed it to the cows or destroy it. It gets destroyed. It can't last the winter if they can't feed the cows. So we've got a local farmer who then gives us all his spare malt. He malts it himself, gives us a spare malt. We then malt it. We then are partners in then producing his single malt using our copper pot still. So that has been incredibly successful. But their whiskey is markedly different from ours because of the malt. It's a more earthy taste. It is a bigger flavor, which is still great, but it's not what I wanted. So I didn't want to compromise that, although we're working with him to try, and we've now got some mixes of our malts with his malts and malts that we make. That was the first thing. The second thing was that I did not want to compromise was the yeast. And the yeast, we were the first to import AB Mori yeast into the United States. AB Mori, 65% of all single malts in the world are made by AB Mori. There's AB Mori, there's Lallemans, there's Kerry's in the UK. But we were the first to import AB Mori. So we wanted a yeast because a lot of single malt whiskey distilleries have come off the back of brewers it's been started by brewers. And brewers are masterful at self-promulgating or using yeast as flavors and tastes. We didn't want that. We wanted to stick to the basics. And so importing the yeast, now it's widely used in America, importing the malted barley, importing the still, were the three things that I would not compromise. Because I fully believe that the water, the climate, the new oak barrel, the shape, style of the still, the pot still, give it that uniqueness of our Boulder, or American single malt whiskey, or Boulder single malt whiskey. So that's what I wanted to do, and we're those edges now, but our flagship whiskey that's how we're making it now. And there's not that beer flavor in our whiskey that some distilleries have. Oh, you there?
I just want to check with Phil. Are you hearing background noise? I'm trying to figure out where it kind of sounds like it's just coming from my computer. Maybe I'm trying to find it.
I'm in a mildly noisy environment, so you may be hearing some from me because I've got the whole family and the dog above me.
Gotcha. Okay.
Well,
I just making
can hear
sure.
a little bit. It's like somebody heavy breathing, but
right. Yeah. I was like, yeah, maybe just mute if you're not speaking, and hopefully you'll remember to unmute. That's always the trouble with that. But thanks. Cool. Man, Christmas week stream, right? Like no shortage. It wouldn't be a Demi-Taste production, right? It wouldn't be a Single Malt Frontier podcast if we didn't have technical difficulties. That's what our audience has come to expect at this point. We try to make light of it.
Yeah.
Okay, before we get too far further along, I do want to kind of introduce another element of Boulder Spirits that I find really great for introducing people to American Single Malt. And just to give you a preview, we'll see if this makes sense to everybody. So I want to touch on the peated, but I know that the peated has more peat than Leave No Trace, but it is also a lower proof. So I do kind of think that we should probably go through the peated before we get to Leave No Trace.
Mm-hmm.
And on our way to Leave No Trace, I think we'll touch on the 10 Essentials and talk about that series as well. So the next thing I'm going to pour is the peated. And we can talk a bit about the philosophy of bringing that into the portfolio as well. Because what I know of your peated malt is that typically you don't use the entirety of the barley in a single distillation is peated. You do a bit of a mix, or maybe that's you blend the barrels after the fact. Which way is that?
Yeah, so we blend the barrels after the fact. So when we bring our malt in already infused with that peat through the malting process, i.e. the drying process, using peat as the fuel source in the drying, we bring it in, and I think if memory serves me right, we brought it in at about 32 ppms. Now you can purchase it low, medium, or high, depending what malting house you use. And I wanted to make this, I say an introduction, and Ryan calls it an introduction. I call it more of an expression, because introduction sounds as though it's a little bit substandard. I like to say expression. And this is the difference between American ways of saying things and Scottish ways of saying things. But I had to do a peated, and I wanted to make it low in that phenol count. So once we have distilled it, and there's a few methods of distilling it. You cut the tails off. You tend to find traditionally you cut the tails off a little later. So you're squeezing the last phenols out of the malt. We do it a little differently. We don't run it as long as you would do in a Scottish distillery. So our tails are cut off quite early. And I think that does have an impact in the taste and flavor initially. When we put it in, we best guess is about 15 to 20 phenols per million. So it's very, very low. And we then blend it down to that 15 or 20 phenols per million, because I didn't want something that was overpowering. I always liken it, and I'll get some hate mail here, is to Laphroaig 10-year to me is a little bit too much. It's a little bit too much. And I think that sits at about 40 or 50 phenols. And that was the number one seller in America. It may still be. And that, to a lot of people, is what peated malt is. And to me, it's not what peated malt is. It's too much for me. So there's a love-hate relationship. And that love-hate, I love watching people taste the peated malt. When they say, I don't really like peated malt, they taste ours. And what it opens their eyes to So I love giving people taste of this. I also see those who don't like peated malt, their expressions in their faces as well. But yeah, a low phenol count, an expression of peat. And I mean, I don't get much in the nose, for example, but when you take, your first sip, 1, 2, 3, boom, it's there. It stays in the palate for quite a while. So it's still definitely a peated single malt.
You referenced Richard earlier, and I don't think you were talking about Richard Patterson. Maybe you were. When you just said it holds long in the mouth, I was thinking of the Richard Patterson, the way that he does the tasting with the whole, like, he throws out the glass of whiskey and then fills it up again and then does the thing where holding it. Yeah, exactly. And you've got the same glass there, actually, the Capita. Well, I guess on the topic of glassware, are you at the distillery? Do you use Glencairns or Capitas? This is just a random off the wall question.
Yeah, we use Glencairns. We've got these glasses as well. This was actually whiskey. This is a Whiskey Live Paris glass. But yeah, we tend to use Glencairn, and one of the reasons we use Glencairn is because I know the family of Glencairn. They're the next village to me from where I was brought up. So I'm quite how can I say it, loyal to Glencairn, because I know their great story and their history and where they manufacture and what they do. Yeah.
I like to think of it whenever glassware comes up. I sort of like to describe for anybody where this is something you can relate to. Sometimes you'll play like a racing game, like a video game that's like a racing game that's meant to be a simulation of whether it's Mario Kart or Cruisin' USA. Man, I'm dating myself on that one. Yes, I'm a Nintendo 64 gamer. That's me right there. The cars have stats, right? And it's like the handling and the acceleration and the braking and the top speed and all that sort of thing. And I like to describe the Glencairn as a balanced middle of glassware, where you've kind of got, it's just good, or not just good, but it's fairly good at everything across the board pretty evenly. Mm-hmm. And then you'll have other glasses that say, we're better at, if you've got low proof spirits, well, you'll be better in this glass. We're better at bringing out phenols. We're better at bringing out fruity aromas. This is a really good glass if you've got high proof spirits, like that sort of thing. And in that way, sort of motivate, there's merit to all the different glassware. It does matter. But Glencairn is a pretty safe happy middle where anything you taste in a Glencairn is gonna express well, if not ideally. I don't know. I'm just this is
Yeah.
there's no point at all to this sidebar when we're talking to Boulder Spirits. It just came up. So
No, I get.
anyway,
I
let's get this back on track. So I agree with you. Something like Lafroig, Ardbeg, let's see. I don't think Lagavulin to me doesn't come across as too peaty, but Lafroig certainly, where peat is the flavor now, right? It's so peaty that peat is the flavor. And don't get me wrong, I'm a peat head. I love peat. I'll go for Octomore on occasion, knowing full well that peat is the main flavor I'm going to be getting. And the longer I've spent studying whiskey and reviewing whiskey, the more I feel that using peat as a seasoning, as a canvas for other flavors to play off of, opens the door to such rich expression of whiskey in so many other ways that you'd otherwise be missing out on. And I like that Boulder Spirits brings in just enough peat that there's no doubt you're tasting peated whiskey. And yet, that isn't the main flavor of their peated whiskey.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore
absolutely.
here. It enhances what else is there.
I appreciate that, and I love watching people drink this. There's not many people are doing peated whiskey in the US. Westlands, McCarthy's. Oh, I'm going to miss people out, but it's a divisive whiskey to a lot of people. I've had people literally spitting it out because they don't like that. It's a bit like I'm not a big mezcal fan. I like tequila, but I don't like mezcal. I don't like that smokiness. But I like the smokiness of peat, but not too much. Definitely not Octomore. Definitely not. But I'm proud of this because of the feedback, face-to-face feedback I get from people, i.e., not what they say, the expressions in their face when they drink peated malt. And we may do a heavier peated malt in the future. I don't see it. I think we're going to keep that to that low phenol count. And No, I was going to move on to the sherry cask, but I'll leave that for just now.
I don't think I have a sherry cask here, actually. Out of everything I have peat, I have the 10 essentials, I have the bottled in bonds, which I think are not finished, right? It's just new oak.
Yes.
The peated, the 10 essentials, leave no trace. I don't think is leave no trace a sherry finish?
So leave no trace of the sherry finish. So that is the peated malt finished in sherry.
Gotcha.
We've got some releases that are just from the leave no trace is the peated malt finished in a sherry.
Okay, what I found interesting about let's stop over at the 10 essentials real quick. By the way, since I'm looking at the backs of the labels, I just want to call out, I love that the peated malt on the back of the label says that it is flavors that are unique to Colorado with a Scottish accent. I thought that was really cute. And I also think that really does play out in the flavor profile of the whiskeys. We may have lost Alastair again, so I'm going to wait for a second. Are you back?
Yeah, but
just about.
I'm back.
Okay, we can hear you again. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure where we sort of left off in what I was saying. But I was making reference to the back label of the peat. It says flavors unique to Colorado with a Scottish accent, which I do think plays out in the flavor profile of the product. And my next question was, is there any peated component in the 10 essentials?
No.
Okay. So
there's
the 10 essentials. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so the 10 essentials is the second entry in the Trails series, if I understand correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I did not get to try the first one. So aside from the theme of the trails, the hiking theme, the 10 essentials being 49.5%, which is mostly water, which I thought was really cute. And now we have the Leave No Trace, which is a sherry finished, lightly peated expression. What is sort of the unifying design philosophy behind this series?
So it was all about Colorado, Trailhead, 10 Essentials, and now Leave No Trace. So the theme for the last 3 years is, because as small distilleries, we will bring in finishing barrels as and when they appear, or we want to do some more blending. But normally we only have, in fact, I think we've got maybe about 15 finishing barrels. That's all we have at the moment. So a lot of these are only brought out at the distillery or selected retail outlets in Colorado or some other states that have got enough people that are wanting it. So it's very, very limited. So the theme is the outdoors. That's what Colorado is all about. I don't know what next year is going to bring, but we've got cognac barrels lying there now, sherry, port, Armagnac. We've got muscatel barrels that we are maturing. They're not ready yet, and we will come up with a fourth theme. So it's more about finished whiskey that we wanted to make this about, for the real enthusiasts who know our brand, who know what they're going to be, that can maybe taste our products, and they're always excited about the new ones coming out.
I can tell you I am, for sure. Let's see. So I'm gonna. I know that Phil has the 10 essentials. I'm gonna pour a little of the 10 essentials myself, so that if the conversation sort of stays on this whiskey, we'll all have the same thing in the glass. But before we get too far along, there were a couple of questions that came in. First of all, let's just take a step back to Barry Reed asks, are you bringing in peated barley from Europe as well? So I think this goes back to the question of where are you getting your barley from? If I understand correctly, all of your barley comes from Scotland, or comes from the UK. Is that correct?
Yeah. So our barley comes. Yes, that's correct. So, well, not everything. So our malted barley comes from Scotland. Almost all the Scottish distilleries now, and English single malt whiskey distilleries, I believe there's about 13 or 14 even English whiskey distilleries. They tend to have it all pre-malted because it's then consistent, a level standard. So we buy it in already malted that's used peat for the infusion during the malting process, or unpeated. So yes, we bring it in. Now, what we also have done is our local malting house called Root Shoot, which is about 45 minutes drive from here. We have started to play around, and when we get on to the Leave No Trace, we'll talk about that. We started playing around with their malt as well, and they're getting towards that distiller's malt that we will start putting in, and we actually put into some of our whiskies as well. So we're moving that line, but it's a very, very, very slow process. And we have got, in fact, sorry, I forgot to say, yeah. So we've actually got our last distillation, which was about a month ago. We used exclusively American malt, and as an experiment to see what it comes off the still as, and it came off very differently. And once it's been in the barrels, but we've got an idea of what it's going to be like anyway, because we've been laying down Root Shoot whiskey for, wow, that's been about 6 years now. So we know what it's going to taste like.
I have a tentative plan to have root shoot spirits and root shoot maltings and spirits on my podcast. Same people, obviously, and we know that they're distilled by Vapor Distillery. And we wanted to talk to them in the context of what it's like to be a malter and supplying malt for American Single Malt, because of course there's American beer, there's other whiskeys, there's a lot of products that malt go into, but American Single Malt being the topic du jour, at least as far as this podcast is concerned, and also the new regulation. We thought it would be cool to talk to them and get their perspective on that. What I didn't realize, if I heard you correctly, is that you're incorporating root shoot maltings malt into Boulder Spirits malt products now. Is that correct?
So the Leave No Trace that we're going to about to taste, that Leave No Trace has got, I believe it's about 10% of their malt in that Leave No Trace. And
okay, very cool.
And a couple other little things that we've done we'll talk about, but we blended it in ever so slightly. We also have probably about 20 bars laid down for us just on their stuff. And they are, and that's great that you're having them on, because it's almost identical process, but they dictate that process in collaboration with us. So it's uniquely their single malt whiskey. And it'd be really interesting tasting our whiskey, our bottled and bond whiskey, against Root Shoot's whiskey. And then you're going to be able to see that difference in the malt as well. And they've been really innovative in using different malts, different, how can I say, mash bills of malt within their process, their production. So they've used pale ale, they've used nothing too hoppy, but they've used various different malts.
Okay, I couldn't resist. I had to pour the Leave No Trace because we were already talking about it. And then, despite myself, I went for a sip right away because I know how good that is. And I know that, like, in terms of what has Doug published about Leave No Trace, I've actually been, it's been a busy quarter for me, and I haven't been doing as much like reviewing and posting on Instagram. But anytime I get a chance to talk about Boulder since 6 months ago or whenever it was that I got this bottle, I've been bringing Leave No Trace into the discussion because, to me, this is one of the things that really pushes the envelope of what American Single Malt can taste like. And in this particular case, it's not like an extreme of flavor, like you've never had fruit like this, or you've never had peat like this. It's more like this is one way where an American-inspired single malt whiskey can be delicately balanced and have a broad range of flavor. And really stand out as this is the special bottle that you want to bring out for a holiday celebration. This is the special bottle you bring out to, a farewell party for a coworker, as I did. This is a special occasion whiskey is what this is. And I should also say, when we were talking about the ratification news last week on the 18th, I went off for about 10 minutes about how amazingly priced these products are. The Leave No Trace is only $75. And that is the highest price of any of these single malts. So if you're not trying these, you're missing out, right? That's my PSA to everyone watching. If you haven't tried Boulder Spirits yet, you're missing out. These are phenomenally priced whiskeys for what you get. Now that's my soapbox about.
Well, no, I appreciate that. They are, and we don't have the brand awareness, and that's the big thing. The brand awareness of Boulder Spirits versus some of the other guys who, they can use that supply and demand on their products and price a lot higher. So we're trying to build a following. Our prices are very fair. You can buy actually the Leave No Trace. We've got a limited amount on our shop left. We still have a few bottles of that left on our Shopify site if you go looking.
Yep. So link in the description to the Boulder Spirits website where you can find the shop, and you can still purchase these whiskeys. I believe they run from
you back?
Yeah, you cut out for a bit, but I was prattling on as I do.
Oh no, you can. The Leave No Trace. There's still some bottles available on our Shopify site. If you go to boulderspirits.com, go through that. You can actually buy. I don't think we've got any more 10 essentials online, but we definitely have some Leave No Trace, because we don't have enough to put it through distribution. Just specialist shops that have asked for it, and then the rest of it sold at our distillery, our Pearl Street tasting room that we've just opened, and our online store.
So on the note of pricing, since we've talked a little bit about pricing, I think another comparison that I can make as a consumer of both Scotch, single malt Scotch, and American single malt whiskey, I think that Boulder Spirits comes just about as close as you're going to get to price matching equivalent quality Scotch. In some cases, maybe even beat it. But I want to get the perspective from Alastair, where presumably you grew up in Scotland, and I mean grew up, like, you know, as of legal drinking age, certainly. You probably experienced single malt Scotch in Scotland, and if you had to pick a brand to compare where you think that Boulder Spirits compares really well to a particular Scotch that maybe that you used to think was a favorite or still is your favorite, or open-ended question, like how do you feel about the way that Boulder Spirits compares to Scotch?
You know, I've had a lot of very eminent. So we're distributed actually in Scotland, and one of the proudest days I've ever had in my life is when our single malt whiskey was distributed in Scotland. It was taken up by a distributor, and I did a huge tour around Scotland, you know, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, to the specialist whiskey shops, because in the UK, the grocery stores control everything as far as alcohol is concerned. And now you've got specialist whiskey stores in most cities. And I went round and I got a great reception because people were interested in knowing what American single malt whiskey was. But I did get a lot of eminent Scotch whiskey distillers who will remain nameless because I don't want to drop them in it, as it were, and tasting them and telling me what they thought of it. And what they definitely felt was, yes, it's uniquely American. It's got that sweetness from that new oak barrel. It's got a little bit more oakiness than you would get in a Scotch, but there was taste and flavors there that they were comparing to existing Scotch whiskies. So, for example, our port cask, what kept on coming out was Glenfarclas. What came out with our lightly peated was Talisker. And our main one was all over the place. Our flagship was all over the place. But it really gave me great, you know, how can I say it, pride that American single malt whiskey, just as Japanese did, just as Sullivan's Cove and Tasmania did, give us another few years. We're almost there. We're there anyway, but you will start to see, and you are seeing, American single malt whiskey going into major competitions and being judged as some of the best single malts in the world. And it's only going to accelerate now that that new standard of recognition, standard of identity has been given, which is going to take time, but it's happening as we speak. So I would say that, yes, our whiskies have got a lot of reminders in them of what some of the Scotch whiskies have, but we don't want to be Scotch. We are an American single malt whiskey for all the reasons of water location, microclimate, new oak, now second fill oak being allowed. All those reasons make it uniquely American.
Awesome. So Phil has indicated that he's got to drop off the call in just a couple of minutes. So I want to ask his question before we move on too far from this point. So in speaking about peat and smoky flavored whiskeys, one of the things we see in the world of single malt that America does uniquely is the wood smoked malted barley. So Phil asks, has there been any interest in utilizing wood smoke malted barley in your products?
No. And it's not because I've got anything against it. Yeah, it's not because I've got anything against it. It's just that, I think our priorities in our own mind, there's only so much we can do. And what we brought out so far, I mean, honestly, what we brought out so far, there's limited space on the shelves in most liquor stores. And even most liquor stores, it's maybe the only top 20% liquor stores will even carry craft spirits because of the price point, because of the maybe lack of knowledge of the brand or any of craft brands. So we don't get all our whiskies on the shelves. We might get, I think with our single malts, we've got 9 single malts at the moment, but only probably 4 of those are on the shelves. The rest of them are special releases, might put them online, might have them from the distillery tasting room, but it's our fun way to play with things. Introduce that to a liquor store. It's too many. So we may in the future do more smoked whiskey, but it'll be for our own enjoyment and distillery release only.
Okay. Well, because it is the day before Christmas Eve, I can't let Phil go without having a toast in his honor. So as a matter of sending Phil off, and we'll continue for another 20 minutes or so, I think, but as a matter of sending Phil off, I just wanted to say, Phil, thank you for being with me on this American Single Malt podcasting journey all this year and some of last year as well. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show, and I hope that we continue making great content in the new year. But for now, I will let you go join your holiday festivities. And I know you have the 10 essentials in front of you. I will cheers you. Cheers to you, Phil. Thanks very much. And
Thank you.
have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Sponsored.
All right. Yeah, Phil, I think once you've finished uploading, you can drop out of the call anytime. Yeah, cool. All right. All right. Let me see if I'm missing any other questions while we've derailed for questions. I think we're all set. Okay. So since it was one of the stated reasons for bringing you on the show, right after the ratification of American Single Malt Whiskey, we wanted to talk about sort of the environment of American Single Malt Whiskey producers. So by and large, not everybody, but almost everybody, like at least the grand majority of American Single Malt Whiskey producers are pledged members of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission, which means that besides agreeing to this now ratified standard, there's also transparency requirements and all this other sorts of stuff. Now that's all great, and we can also divide this. So there's everybody who's part of the commission. There's everybody who now has to follow the same rules whether they like it or not. But then there's another interesting subdivision of the realm of producers, which is there are producers who I've heard the commission talk about. For example, there are the producers of American Single Malt Whiskey who focus exclusively on American Single Malt Whiskey. It's hard to say that there are, depending on how closely you look, there aren't a whole lot of them really at all. I can think Westland and Westward, Stranahan's, chat, help me out. Like, I don't know if there's really that many producers of American Single Malt that don't make another product. Now, Balcones now has dropped the rest of their portfolio in favor of American Single Malt Whiskey. Alastair, what did you say? Which other brand?
Oh, sorry, I said Virginia Distillery. They focus
yes.
primarily on
so there's
all the big ones.
Right. So there's primarily, then there's exclusively. So like I would like to say, for example, that Copperworks in Seattle feels like exclusively a single malt distillery. In actual fact, they also have a vodka and gin product, which is made from single malt mash. So depending on how you slice that particular onion, you could say that Copperworks is a completely single malt distillery. But on the other hand, they have other products. But they certainly are a single malt focused distillery, and that definitely is a larger category of producers, the single malt focused distilleries, versus everybody else who's got a bunch of other products and they're like, let's also make an American single malt. Why not? There's not really a question there. I'm just sort of like drawing some lines and just sort of outlining the space. Here essentially is the question. The most interesting division as applies to Boulder Spirits is that a lot of these distilleries that are focused on American single malt whiskey are at this point majority owned or almost majority owned by large drinks conglomerates of some sort, international or otherwise, that are essentially to some degree maybe calling the shots about what style of whiskey they're going to make. And Boulder Spirits remains independent. So I want to, if I understand correctly, and hopefully I don't have my information wrong, unless you want to announce something. What is it like being an independent producer of American single malt in the current landscape of American single malt whiskey?
I'm going to take a step back. So, before you made that comment about being part of larger organizations, most of the ones that you mentioned, I don't want to mention names, but most of the ones you mentioned at the beginning, yes, they focus on single malt, but they're part of companies that pump out tens of thousands of gallons of vodka. They are ring-fenced within their organization. So Diageo owns, I don't know, 30 to 40 single malt distilleries in Scotland. They keep them incredibly separate and try and create a story around each and every one. But the reality is they're part of a conglomerate that are told what to do and how to do things, and they have the financial backing. So keeping it small, keeping that story of individual distilleries is really important. But the consumer isn't fooled. They know that X distillery is owned by this conglomerate. This beer is owned by, a conglomerate out in Germany or whatever. So you mentioned Copperworks, independent. They are like us. We've got to look at the financial side of it. So we focus on single malt whiskey, but we also do a bourbon. We can do that. We're trying, and our distillery started doing gins because we don't have that backing, that finance, that money, that corporate identity. So Copperworks, ourselves, Santa Fe, for example, they make other products for their tasting room. They might commercially sell some of their gin, but really that's for their tasting room. We've got 2 tasting rooms, and for us to be able to be commercial, we can't just offer single malt. So for a distiller to make bourbon or gin or a liqueur is quite easy for us to do, to add to our portfolio. Now, we don't necessarily distribute that. We don't really go outside Colorado with our gin, for example. So there is an old saying that really is, there's an old saying, jack of all trades, master of none. And what the big guys like to do is ring fence and make themselves to be seen as the master of just single malt or vodka or gin or whatever. And I'm very aware of that, because the most successful ones are the ones that are focused on one thing or are perceived to be focused on one thing. With us, we talk only about single malt whiskey, to be honest. So we've just opened a tasting room a couple months ago on a really main thoroughfare in Boulder. And 90% of our products are sold is single malt whiskey. So we're really focusing on that, Doug.
Okay. I guess to me that doesn't surprise me. I've tried your bourbon. I don't believe I actually had the pleasure of trying your vodka or your gin. There was only so much time while I was visiting for ACSA. But I did try the bourbon, the regular and the cask strength, and I thought it was quite good. I'm by no means qualified to comment on the global like perspective of what one brand's bourbon does next to another, because what I know for bourbon is the biggest stuff, and there's too many craft bourbons for me to boil that particular ocean. So all I can say is I thought it was quite good. I have heard it said by people who are fans of your bourbon that your bourbon is and maybe this grain of salt coming from bourbon drinkers, that maybe your bourbon is actually like your biggest marginal advantage. Not that it's necessarily better than the single malt, but that it's better than, like, so much better than other craft bourbons in the area, for example. I don't quite know how to contextualize that comment. I think it's worth calling out that, yes, Boulder Spirits makes bourbon, and it's not just checking a box. They make really good, thoughtful bourbon on the pot still. It has a lot of flavor.
And it's not. And one of the things, so our bourbon is pretty unique in that it's got so much malted barley. So we've got more malted barley in our bourbon than any other distillery in the US. We've got 44% malted barley, 51 corn, tick, we're a bourbon, and 5 rye. And we've had more plaudits from our bourbon than our single malt. And the reason for that is it's not necessarily our bourbon is better. It's because American single malt whiskey isn't known as much, whereas bourbons is the drink of America. So, Fred Minnick put our Cask Strength bourbon 2 years ago in the top 10 whiskeys of America. Unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And last year it was the top 25. This year, I don't know where we're going to be. But that's our Cask Strength with the high malted barley content. So, yes, I'm coming on this podcast talking about single malt whiskey, but I'd be amiss not to talk about bourbon, but also knowing that we're really focusing on single malt.
Yep. So, okay, on that note, I have to ask. So it's as much. It's as, let's say, it sounded like you said. Sorry, one more time. What's the mash bill? Was it 51% corn, 44%
barley, and
5% rye? Okay, so I have to ask, why the 5% rye? Because your flavor grain there is clearly the malt.
Yeah, when we looked at doing this, so the bourbon came very quickly after us starting the single malt, and it actually was literally, and I shouldn't say it's an afterthought to the single malt, but I realized, I'm from Scotland. I thought I could turn the American consumer off bourbon and onto single malt, but that was quite a naive thought. So we sat down and we thought, right, we've got to do a bourbon, but if we're going to do a bourbon, we'll do something really different. And I went through some really eminent bourbon makers in Kentucky, guys who really know their stuff as distillers. And I asked them a simple question. I said, why don't you use malted barley as a flavoring to your bourbon? And just like Scots distillers, when you ask them anything, their answer is, that's not how we do it. And I thought, well, craft distilling can do these kind of things. So there's craft distillers that are using, I had a millet whiskey from, who was it? Koval in Illinois. Millet. I mean, you would think it's going to taste horrible, but it was fantastic. And that's the thing that craft distilling can do. Whether it's financially viable or not, they can play around with these things. And hats off to the Kentucky guys and Scots guys. They've got a winning formula, so they're sticking to it. They're not going to change. They're going to carry on with what's making them money. But the craft distilling industry can play around. Now, a lot of times it's to their detriment because they create, I know one whiskey distillery who will remain nameless that did about 30 of the most amazing niche spirits and bitters and various things. They just went bankrupt. They just had to close their doors. But they were producing some of the most amazing spirits in the US, but they were so niche, so personal to them, but there wasn't the market unless, a tiny, tiny niche market. So that's why we did the malt. But the 5%, there was a rationale in my mind why I went 5% rye, but I don't think it made much difference to the whiskey at all because it's corn malt.
with a right, like the reason for the most bourbons, the reason for the tiny amount of barley is the enzymes. It's not necessarily the flavor. Because at that level of what 8-12% barley, you're not getting a lot of that flavor in there. Maybe when you're getting up to that 12-15%, you're getting some.
Sure.
But 5% rye feels like we just wanted to have a 3-grain bourbon, right? Just to fit in with everyone else. That's one way of looking at it.
I hate, that was probably our thought process at the time, because we thought the rye wasn't going to make much difference, but we'll do 3 grains instead of 2. And I'm embarrassed to say that, but that's probably the thought process.
Things come about for reasons, and one way or another, what you ended up with was an award-winning bourbon, so you can't complain about that.
Yes, absolutely. And what I loved about it was that malted barley within the bourbon, because even when I made it, people were saying, well, you don't know how it's going to, how that corn is going to interact with the malt after 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Well, it's interacted bloody well. And for me, it just as a single malt whiskey drinker, it calms that heat and sweet down you get that I get from that heavy corn. So it's that heat and sweet just calm down a little bit more. And what I love about our bourbon is that you're not getting all corn sweetness. You're getting corn sweetness, but you're accentuating the sweetness from the barrel as well. So bourbon drinkers drink it and go, yeah, there's maltiness there. But where's that sweetness? That corn sweetness is there, but there's also another sweetness. And I'm saying that's coming from the barrel. That's coming from that new oak barrel.
Sorry, I'm distracted here because my dog is trying to get attention. I'm trying to get her up on camera, but she doesn't want to get picked up right now. So I'm trying to remember if we've ever seen her on camera on the show before. But I kind of feel like she's not going to let me unless I really wrangle her. So I'm probably just going to leave it alone. So, okay, on the note of independence and the fact that, to look at some, I'm not going to say it's a universal thing that if you're owned by a Diageo or a Remy or a Proximo or whoever, Beam, Suntory, actually, House of Suntory, if you're owned by one of these large conglomerates, there's others, right? It's not necessarily a universal constant that when you're owned by a big conglomerate, your prices are high. In actual fact, the history of a company like Westland is that their prices haven't changed. They're now owned by Remy, and they share a philosophy with another prominent whiskey maker in the Remy portfolio, Bruichladdich. There's a lot of similarity in their products, philosophically wise. Westland's prices have always been high, and it's not because they're owned by Remy. Balcones's prices have, if anything, been on the low side, and as far as I can tell, the ownership by Diageo hasn't changed that. So that's not necessarily a universal constant, but what does seem clear to me is that when you're an independently owned product portfolio, priced as competitively as Boulder Spirits is, the question starts to come, how are you managing to stay competitive on price in an industry like this, where prices are going up, everything is expensive, barley is expensive. Everybody else in American single malt seems to be saying, hey, being a craft single malt producer, barley is expensive. Being a craft scale is expensive. We have to price higher. How is it that Boulder Spirits is managing to keep prices so competitive?
I think we're probably not raised our prices over the last year or last 2 years as a lot of other distilleries have. And also in Colorado, we're losing a significant amount to Angel share. So we might be losing about 4% per annum. So we've just literally emptied a barrel, an 8-year-old barrel, and it was in wine gallons, it was half empty. In proof gallons here in Colorado, it will go up a little bit. So we lost about 40% of our proof gallons. Yes, there's always going to be reviews of pricing. I look at where the market is here in Colorado. We're distributed elsewhere, but Colorado's got lower excise tax. So when you go to Washington, for example, we try and look at where we would sit in the market. We don't have the luxury to raise our prices. It's that supply and demand curve. we don't have the luxury we don't have the brand awareness to be able to do as some people have. Even craft distillers have been able to raise their prices significantly. But it's always under review. And probably the answer to your question is it's under review right now in prices. Okay. But Westland started very high. They didn't get the traction they wanted. They didn't raise their prices, but I think other craft has caught up with them. So I think they're probably in the same middle of the road now with single malts.
I think I said about a year ago, actually, that like everybody else increased their prices, but Westland's prices are the same. It's never been more affordable to buy Westland.
I know. You can always go backwards in prices, but you can never go. It's easy to go backwards in price, but it's difficult to go forward in price. And there's an argument to say, start high, and then at least then you can give discounts to retailers and various things like that. I think we just want to be. I think we want to be fair. We want to build a brand and get more volume, and volume then helps the margin as well, because it's economies of scale.
Speaking of volume, how close to production capacity is Boulder Spirits, or is Vapor Distillery? Not even close. There's lots of room to grow.
Lots of room to go. So I think, like a lot of craft distilleries, I think you get to a point where you've got the barrels stored, that you've been able to afford, and now it's a case of you sell, you build up the cash, you then buy the raw materials, you distill. So we went through last year, we built up our storage quite a bit. This year we won't be doing as much distilling, but if suddenly Europe orders a shipping container of our single malt, we'll be able to then lay down more whiskey. And I think that's representative of most craft distilling. When you get the infusion of money like from Remy or Diageo, the first thing that they do is they get you to lay down way more whiskey so they can then open more markets. So we always got about 1,000 barrels in storage maturing for our current and future sales. But if the sales go up, so does laying down the barrels.
Okay, there's one more question I just had written down. Is I wanted to talk about water. So water, of course, is not only is it important to the philosophy of the 10 essentials being mostly water, but of course, water, most whiskey products are a majority of water. Obviously, once you get past that 50%, you're not necessarily, but water is involved in other parts of the process too. So I wanted to ask you about your water source and what effect you think that has on the whiskey.
So, fascinating subject. Our production water is municipal water. So here in Boulder, we've got, snow melt from the Rocky Mountains. It's municipal water. We put it through a carbon filter. Now, in most municipal water, you're going to have chlorine. Chlorine boils off. Some distilleries will add a little bit of chemicals to dissipate it. We just boil it off. Because production water isn't as important to the proofing water, because anything that is going to be maybe out of kilter on the production water is going to be distilled out. So, but we're still careful about our production water. What we then do is proofing into the barrel, which is not a great deal of water, but then proofing from barrel into bottle. We use a local sourced Eldorado water, which is about 6 miles down the road from here. And we do all our proofing down with that water. And we've done a few experiments with proofing down with deionized water, proofing down with Eldorado water, and proofing down with municipal water from barrel into bottle. And in blind tasting, it was an incredible difference. The deionized water, the local water came third, deionized water came second, Eldorado water won it. There are minerals in that, no bad minerals, all minerals within certain values, but it made a significant difference. And I think there's been loads of experiments in the UK and Scotland with exactly that. Deionized water, local water, Isla water for mixing with, even going into the glass when you're adding a little bit of water. But yeah, we found that. So we always say we're uniquely American because it's the New Oak barrels. We're uniquely Colorado because of the climate, and we're uniquely Boulder because of the water that we use. But it's a huge difference. It's a huge difference.
That's a lovely way of looking at it.
And I think, in fairness, in Colorado, the 130 distilleries, 120 distilleries, they're all using local water, which is really fun. I think in Scotland, a lot of it's deionized water because they all go to central bottling houses. I don't think many distilleries are actually using local water for their bottling because it's central. Glasgow, Edinburgh, and I want to say Inverness have all got massive bottling houses, and they can't use 140 different waters at those bottling houses. But yeah, it makes a massive difference.
Yeah. Well, anybody, I mean, there's a point in time where I was I sort of realized that coffee wasn't my niche of content. People who are coffee content creators are way nerdier about coffee than I am. But to the extent that I'm nerdy about coffee, people who've really messed around with their coffee brewing water know this already, that there's a huge difference between tap water and filtered water and deionized water. Like reverse osmosis water is almost just, it gives you hollow and terrible coffee. And the best water for coffee brewing is actually a very intentionally re-ionized reverse osmosis pure distilled water, where you start with that pure distilled water and then you intentionally add some minerals back into it through a re-ionization process. And that's the water that makes the best coffee. And people have done tons of experiments about that. I'm sure there's some opinions one way or another, but it just turns out that mineral-free water doesn't make good coffee. Tap water with its chlorine and whatever other impurities it has doesn't make good coffee. And what actually makes coffee is a very intentionally minerally balanced water. And it doesn't surprise me in the least that your El Dorado water, which probably has some degree of those good minerals, actually produces the best tasting whiskey. Not in the least surprised by that.
Yeah, well, you just educated me a little bit on coffee. I didn't realize it was that nerdy, but but yeah, no, I get it. It makes the world of difference. It really does. Does it make a massive difference what you're pouring in if you're adding water? To a lesser extent, but I think it's still important. So when we do our tastings here, again, we only use El Dorado water because we just think it's fitting for what we do. But when you're only adding a tablespoonful of water to put down a little bit, does it make a massive difference? It makes a difference, but maybe not quite as big. I don't know.
Yeah,
not sure. I tend to not put water in my whiskey anyway, so
same.
I don't really care. For
when
myself.
I'm reviewing, I try to add a couple of drops, and I just use plain filtered water from my fridge. Nothing fancy. We have good tap water here where it tastes pretty good on its own. That's passed through a carbon filter in the fridge, and that's all I do with it. I'm not trying to get the purest water or the most minerally balanced water. It's just not bad water. It doesn't actively taste bad, and I find that does a good enough job.
Yeah. Well,
but I am only adding a couple.
One of the reasons why. Yeah, one of the reasons Scotland got such a great reputation for their single malt was the water supply. The water in Scotland is very, very soft, whereas you go across the border into England, it's really hard water. And here in Colorado, it's actually quite hard water as well, unless you're getting it from springs or unless you're getting it from another source for your proofing water. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, all right. There's only one more thing to do to keep with the bit that we're trying to keep up with. I know Phil isn't here, but what we've been doing is we've been saying, rather than choose a favorite whiskey of the night, because we've already probably expressed an opinion of everything that we've tasted, we're going to pour everything that's in our glasses together and then see what that tastes like. And
I've only got fine.
Yeah, we sometimes it's kind of like Phil and I try to remember to keep a little bit in our glass of everything that we've had so far. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way, but usually it does.
Well,
I finished one of my glasses, so I'm actually going to put a little splash back in there again, so I can give it the fair treatment. So what I have here is the New American, the peated malt, the Leave No Trace, and the 10 Essentials, and I'm gonna put these
right.
together and then give them a couple minutes to rest while we maybe ask one last question. So I feel like this is a question we should be asking everybody, but we haven't asked in a while. When you're not drinking your own products, what do you tend to drink?
I do actually get asked that question quite frequently, what my favorite single malt whiskey is. If I'm not drinking my own, I try to drink other bourbons the best I can because I'm not as familiar. I was never brought up with bourbons. So I try and drink bourbons, but I'm a bit, heavy. Corns I struggle with. Ryes I like. But I went on a month's back to Scotland for a month, and it was my opportunity to start going back with my father's whiskey collection, and start drinking Scotch because I tend to drink my own stuff most of the time. There's lots of stuff coming out of Scotland that doesn't come to America. It's expensive to sell in America, but America is a really attractive market to Scotch whiskey. And may that continue depending on the tariffs that may or may not get put on in the coming months. And that's really going to have a big part to play. But when I go back to Scotland, I tend to drink the whiskies that I can't really get here. Not so much individual brands, but more the expressions that they're bringing out that are maybe don't get over to here.
Okay, any particular whiskey standing out to you right now of those Scotch that you can't get here?
To name them, I'm going to struggle because at the times, but I like a lot of Glenmorangie whiskies. They're nice, they're soft, they're palatable. They're sherry cask, they're port cask. Although I was in a bar and it's called, and for those who know any Scottish phrases, a bar in Edinburgh called the Tipsy Midgie. So a midgie is an animal in Scotland that bites you, and the Tipsy Midgie. I was introduced to a lot of expressions of Lefroy that I'd never had because I made the comment about 10-year-old Lefroy is like sucking dirt, and the guy took exception to that. The bartender who runs the Tipsy Midgie in Edinburgh took offence to that, and he then proceeded giving me some Lefroys that I'd never tasted before that were absolutely spectacular. So it doesn't just have 10-year-old Lefroy heavily peated.
Yeah, there's something I don't know if this was one of them, but once Lefroy gets to about 25 plus years old, it transforms from that heavy, dirty, smoky thing to something really light and tropical with just a hint of peat left in it.
Yeah. I mean, most of our peated malt is probably sitting at about 5 years old now. So we found that it's just getting lower and lower and lower in that phenol count. But then what happens is the quality of the whiskey itself, and not having that maybe overpowering peat flavor, starts shining through a little bit more. I think too much peat it's as you said right at the beginning, it's the flavor of the whiskey peat rather than something which accentuates the whiskey or adds to the whiskey. It is the major flavor point.
I did not ask you about probably one of the more important pieces is that Boulder is essentially a mile above sea level, more or less. And I know for sure that has an effect on the boiling point of water, probably has a significant effect on the boiling point of alcohol. ethanol specifically, and
Mhm.
all of those congeners that would come through the distillation process, their boiling points and condensation points have to be different. Do you have any controlled experiments where you've figured out how that affects the profile of your whiskey, or whether you're intentionally going along with it, or if that's just the terroir of the distillery, the something you can't control that it just ends up making the whiskey what it is?
So you can't really control anything. One of the biggest questions is any of those boiling points, because the world of science can be really, really strange. Does any of those boiling points flip?
Mhm.
So, and the answer that I've been given by several PhD chemists, chemical engineers, and various people is no, it doesn't. And even if it
Okay.
did, your ethanol is going to all come out. It's not going to leave anything behind, because if they flipped, you could end up with certain things in the hearts that you may not want. But the answer is no, none of them flip. The climate here in Colorado, the uniqueness is that swings in temperature, swings in pressure, sucking the barrel, sucking that new make spirit into the char filter. Angels share twice as much. But what is also interesting about the climate here in Colorado, because we're a mile high, and that's not the only reason why it's so dry, but it's incredibly dry here. So as a result, we are pulling out water particles at a different rate to ethanol particles than you would do in another microclimate that might be got humidity, whether it be hot humidity or cold humidity. So what we find is our proof starts going up. And we just emptied 10 barrels of 8-year-old bourbon, and the proof on that went from 120 to 153.
Wow.
So that's the highest that I've seen if the barrel entries at 120. Go to Scotland, you put it in 125 and it goes down. Or the Pacific Northwest, it will go down, I would suggest. So we are losing half in wine gallons and about 40% in proof gallons over that 8-year period. So when you talk about pricing, you've got to take that into consideration.
Yep.
But yeah, it's fascinating. And,
Okay.
and the microclimates of America are going to give you. So we, you know the guys from Lost Lantern.
Yes.
They purchased a barrel from us, matured it for about a year and a half in the Northeast, and the whiskey, when we tasted it, was there was a difference to our whiskey that had spent another year and a half down here. So that is the fascinating part of microclimates throughout America, and that's one of the reasons a lot of bourbon guys in Kentucky are looking at other microclimates and going, Colorado. Again, Fred Minnick put 4 Colorado bourbons in his top 100. So that tells you something about not necessarily the greatness of the distillers in Colorado, but what impact the microclimate is giving Colorado and what it's giving whiskey.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something fascinating about, I live in the Pacific Northwest. I'm very familiar with, the Copperworks and the Westland and the Westward and the McCarthys. Some of my favorite American single malts, and they're also in my backyard. So like I'm biased to be drinking more of those. Then there's also the Midwest has surprised me, as it's so cold there. Why does the whiskey taste so mature? There's something different about that climate. And then Colorado in particular, and especially I guess anywhere in the high desert. So Santa Fe and Arizona also. There's something about these whiskeys, but especially Colorado, that captures me. They're different from other bourbons, from other American single malts that I've had. There's something about them that is richly fruity and really nicely balanced compared to what seems like essentially the same whiskey made somewhere else, like Central Texas or California or the East Coast somewhere. There's something about Colorado. I mean, there's Boulder, Stranahan's, Ironton. I know there's others, but those off the top of my head. Talnua, which is not making American single malt, but you can still taste it there. And Ironton, of course, has the bourbon as well. You can taste it there. Boulder, same. There's something regionally specific about the flavor profiles of these whiskeys that I find completely fascinating. And to me, it has to be something about the altitude, the day-night cycle, the aridity, as opposed to the humidity. And it's hard to control any one of those things because Colorado is its own essentially microclimate that everybody's benefiting from.
Yeah.
And I mean, people could look at me and say, "Hey, you know, I'm biased. I've been to ACSA. They've shown me around." But listen, at ACSA, there were 200 whiskeys that won awards, like 180 whiskeys won awards, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I tasted as many of those as I could. And the ones that stood out to me more than any others were that set of Colorado whiskeys. And not just because I was in Colorado. There's something about them.
No, there absolutely is. And that's not taking away from the other regions. The other regions, I would love to get a PhD research paper that's non-biased, not sponsored by the big boys that go, right, here's the 5 microclimates of the US. Let's swap barrels. Let's take an analysis. And let's not come up with any negative. Just say, hey, what Colorado does is gives it A, B, C. What Texas does is gives it C, D, E. What the Northwest gives it. And use that information to be able to promote Colorado whiskey, to promote Texas whiskey. Nobody's done that. And if they've done it, it's a brand exercise to make their whiskey sound better than others. So I want somebody independent, nothing to do with me.
Hey,
and we've I
volunteer.
I know it's a long-term, I'll give four barrels to other 4 microclimates if they can do a similar assessment and receive 4 barrels from other microclimates to make that assessment, because I think regions need to understand what the microclimate's giving that whiskey, and it'd be fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
I would love to know more. I'm all for single variable controlled experiments. I have an experiment from Westward where I asked them, could I try your whiskey before you... They don't chill filter, but they cool it down and they pass it through a filter. They call it cold filtering. It's not quite as cold as the typical chill filtration. I asked them, hey, do you sensory notice a difference between those? Is that purely cosmetic? Do you actually... I want to know, can you taste the flavor difference? They said, no, but more than that, we'll let you try. So I have a box of samples. It's a triangle test. They're just labeled ABC. I don't know which 2 are the same. One of them has not been filtered and then aged. Or there's 2 things in there. Either it's filtered or it's not filtered. I don't know which one has the 2. I have to figure out which one's different. So the question is, can I figure out which one's different? Because how often does a consumer get to taste all else equal from the same brand, chill filtered or not chill filtered? I would love to do the same thing with the different regions, but that's a much more expensive project.
Yeah. No, that's going to be fascinating, because the common thoughts are that when you chill filter, you're taking away taste and flavors. Yep. I might suggest yes, you do, but does it degrade the whiskey? I would suggest no. It just gives you a little bit of a different whiskey. So we do get every so often emails from actually our European distributor more than anybody saying, hey, there's a bacteria in the whiskey. There's things floating in it. And I say, well, we've not chill filtered it. The temperature's crashed somewhere.
Right.
This is the reason. This is the rationale.
I don't know if you can see on the camera. I mean,
no, it's a little bit hazy.
I don't see this as a bad thing. And I always say this. VDC, I said the same. You can kind of see there's a haze in the bottom of that bottle.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. That's fine. To me, that tells me, I mean, this is 49.5%. They say that haze shouldn't happen at that level, but it
happens more in our 42 bourbon than it does in our 46 single malt. Absolutely. Yeah. But I send sadly a cut and paste answer to people, and normally I get the answer back, that makes absolute sense. Thank you very much for letting me know. And nobody has asked for their money back. I only know one distillery in Colorado that they put it into a sort of centrifuge, but that in itself, chill filtering is a science in itself to get that right and understand that. And I don't know anybody other than one in Colorado that actually does it. And Colorado gets incredibly low temperatures.
True. Yeah.
Mm.
So I think my office is cold right now. Like, if anything, it's probably like 68 in here or something. That shouldn't be enough to make haze show up. But like, I think it's just the presence of those fats and whatever it is that is precipitating out. If it sits on a shelf long enough, and I've had these for almost a year, 10 months or something, 10 months, it happens, right? And VDC, same thing. For me, I think it's a mark of quality, but like that's coming from that same, assuming that non-chill filtered is fundamentally better. At the very least, I think not chill filtering doesn't hurt, right? So for me, it tells me, hey, that hasn't been filtered. That's just one more reason I don't have to worry about the quality of the flavor in that.
My brain goes to, if you're taking solids out of solution and you're getting rid of those, you're getting not so much taste and flavors. I would say almost mouthfeel.
Yes.
You're going to have a different mouthfeel to that, and I like a heavier mouthfeel in my whiskies. So it's horses for courses, as they say.
Same. Yeah. I like the mouthfeel angle. I think I say, hey, if you think it doesn't affect flavor, I'll tell you what. If you took fats out of it, it affected the mouthfeel, and I like my whiskey to be creamy, if anything.
Correct.
So,
Indeed.
Also, I think this is not well supported by evidence, but anecdotally,
yes,
chill filtered whiskeys burn more. I think the fats protect you a little bit from the ethanol.
Mm-hmm.
That's my hypothesis. I don't know how to test it, but that's my hypothesis.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right. So this has been sitting here for a few minutes. We're not going to do better than that. I've blended together 4 of your whiskeys. When I first took a sip, I felt like it brought out the spiciness from all of them more than anything else. Let's see how it settled down. Okay, so that light peat came back to the front. I think it smells oakier than it used to.
It's difficult to blend peat out.
Mm-hmm. It's always going to be there.
It's not linear.
There's no surprise here. Doing the blend of the different whiskeys never turns out better than the actual individual whiskeys themselves. That would be quite a shock if that were the case. Overall, it's not bad, but I like them better by themselves. So
Good.
I think that's always a relief to people, right? Like some random person on the internet didn't blend your whiskey better than you did.
Yeah. There's a huge skill in that. That.
Absolutely. Yeah, respect the blenders, right? Anybody with single casks all the way, like seriously, respect your blenders. They know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
We didn't talk about the labels today, but we talked about them at length last time. I just want to say, we might as well, or let me bring out the Leave No Trace so that I can get this one more screen time. Boulder Spirits is pretty cool because one of the things they did that not a lot of other people did is they wrote the American Single Malt Whiskey phrase on the label. And my hypothesis, that I haven't talked to anybody from TTB, they won't talk to me. No comment, right? If anybody's ever tried talking to the TTB, you know what I'm talking about, right? There's like, come to our public phone call where we won't say anything. Boulder Spirits is a malt whiskey because it's aged in new oak. And so American Single, prior to January 19th, doesn't have an enforceable legal definition. And so those are just extra words. And so because Boulder's malt whiskey, they can put American Single Malt Whiskey on a single line in a single font. And now, right, you'll be able to apply for the new type American Single Malt Whiskey without altering your labels at all, which is really cool.
Yeah. Sometimes you're lucky, depending on the TTB inspector, COLA inspector, because and hopefully nobody from the TTB is on this call. But when we applied for the one that says with a Scottish accent, it was actually refused, and we petitioned against it because they said that it was trying to liken it to Scotland, and we were saying no. I've got a Scottish accent. It's a Scottish accent. We're trying to be funny, and we petitioned against it, and eventually they said okay. I think they were frightened that the Scots would sue us. Scottish Whisky Association would sue us because they are very litigative about if you called anything Glen or Scottish or anything like that. But yeah, I'm glad we don't have to change our labels. I'm very, very glad.
Yeah, and they're beautiful labels. And I mean, These fit in really nicely with my Scotch too. There's something about the shape of the bottle, that sort of pot still-ish looking neck.
I specifically wanted that because the labels are very, very different. You'll see it's all about location and location and process. So you become very transparent about your process. You'll see number 3 char on it. You'll see 100% malted barley on it. You'll see a picture of the flat irons. You'll see our actual still with the 11-degree angle, because I think it's very important for distilleries, especially craft distilleries, to be very open about the process, and also the location makes a colossal difference to that taste and flavors of your whiskey. And all these you can get even down to the Leave No Trace through our Shopify site on our website for either pick up at the distillery, or, as you know, Colorado doesn't allow direct to consumer, but it comes through our retail partner in Fort Lauderdale, of all places, in Florida.
Okay. I'll go do my homework and figure out who that is. Maybe you don't want to say, but that I think I know who that isn't, at least. But yeah. In any case, we have reached 6 p.m. on Pacific time, and I think now is a great time to call it a night. And it's kind of a shame because it seems like our internet connections have finally just cleared up in the last half hour now, and I would love to keep talking, but it is 2 days before Christmas and there are things to do. So unfortunately, I have to call it a night. It's been lovely speaking with you. I know there's a lot more detail about your personal story that I would personally like to know. For anybody who's regularly watched the show or who's watching the show for the first time in a while and maybe hasn't heard me talk about it, I'm working on a book on American Single Malt Whiskey, more feverishly than ever, because we now officially have a regulation. And I want to tell the stories, right? It's one thing to say, oh, listen to my tasting notes, and for me to be all, high and mighty about my own self. But I think it's quite another, and really the story I would like to tell, where it's about the people who built this category. And there are a few people who I would definitely like to highlight, and Alastair is one of them. So, Alastair, I do hope to get more of your words on the record to be able to tell your story more in depth. But for now, we can absolutely celebrate this wonderful whiskey that you've brought to market, and not just once, but at least 9 times that I'm aware of different expressions. It's a wonderful portfolio. Anybody who's listening who wants to try this, you can try any of these. You want more new oak, you want sherry, you want port, you want heavier on the peat, you want higher alcohol percentage. All of those things are available to you on the Boulder Spirits, and any one of them is going to be a lovely whiskey. I highly recommend them, and at those prices, you can't go wrong. So really do try them. Carrie and everyone else who's still hanging out, thank you so much for watching, as always. Hit the subscribe, the like, leave a comment, share with your friends. Go follow us on Instagram. Go follow Boulder Spirits on Instagram. All of those links and more are in the description, as always. As a notification just in time. And with no further ado, thank you all for watching. And until next time, we'll see you in the Whiskey Lodge. So you can find a link to that in the description as well. So good night, everybody.
Thanks,
cheers,
everyone.
and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
And to you. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.